The greatest mistake a narcissist can make is not choosing the wrong victim. It is betraying the one person capable of seeing both their darkness and their potential. Because once that person walks away, something inside the narcissist begins collapsing that can never be rebuilt the same way. Most people believe the empath is the one left broken after betrayal. Psychology suggests something far more disturbing. In this video, you will discover why the narcissist often loses far more than the empath ever does, and why the damage is rarely visible from the outside. Have you ever noticed that some people become calmer, wiser, and stronger after being deeply betrayed, while others become increasingly desperate to regain control? That difference is not luck. It reveals what was real and what was only an illusion. Stay until the end, because the final insight explains why silence can become the most powerful response a narcissist will ever face. The super empath is often misunderstood because people confuse empathy with weakness. In reality, empathy at its highest expression is not passive. It is an extraordinary ability to perceive emotional patterns, hidden motivations, and unspoken truths beneath the surface of human behavior. While most individuals respond only to words and actions, the super empath senses the emotional reality that exists behind them. This heightened awareness allows them to recognize pain even when it is disguised as confidence, anger hidden beneath charm, or fear concealed by arrogance. They do not simply listen to what people say. They instinctively notice what remains unsaid. This unique perception makes the super empath an unexpected mirror. Every interaction subtly reflects another person's inner world back to them. Someone who is emotionally authentic often feels understood, accepted, and safe in their presence. But a person who has built an identity around deception, superiority, or manipulation experiences something entirely different. Instead of feeling comforted, they may feel exposed without fully understanding why. The empath's presence quietly challenges the carefully maintained image that hides insecurity and unresolved emotional wounds. This reflection is rarely intentional. The super empath does not seek to expose or shame anyone. Their natural authenticity simply creates an environment where false identities become difficult to sustain. A person who depends on admiration and emotional control may initially be drawn toward this genuine warmth because it offers validation unlike anything they have experienced. Yet over time, the same authenticity becomes deeply uncomfortable. The more sincerely the empath connects, the harder it becomes for illusion to survive. This creates an invisible psychological tension. One person moves toward truth while the other struggles to protect a carefully constructed version of themselves. The conflict is not caused by external circumstances alone, but by the silent collision between authenticity and illusion. The super empath becomes a living reminder of everything that has been avoided, denied, or buried beneath years of emotional defenses. In this way, their greatest strength is not extraordinary compassion alone. It is their quiet ability to reveal reality without accusation, allowing hidden aspects of another person's inner world to become impossible to ignore. Betrayal has the power to change a person forever, but its deepest effect is not always destruction. Sometimes it becomes the very event that awakens a level of awareness that could never have emerged through comfort alone. A super empath often enters relationships with an open heart, believing that honesty, patience, and compassion can heal misunderstandings and strengthen emotional bonds. This willingness to see the good in others is one of their greatest qualities. Yet it can also make them vulnerable to repeated disappointment when their trust is abused. At first, betrayal creates confusion rather than clarity. The empath searches for explanations, questioning whether they misunderstood the situation or somehow contributed to the pain they now feel. Because they naturally try to understand the perspectives of others, they often spend more energy examining their own actions than recognizing deliberate manipulation. This period can feel emotionally exhausting as the mind struggles to reconcile genuine affection with experiences of deception, broken promises, or emotional neglect. However, something remarkable begins to happen when the empath stops searching for excuses and starts observing patterns instead. Instead of asking why someone acted in a harmful way, they begin asking why they repeatedly accepted behavior that violated their own values. This subtle shift changes everything. Their attention moves away from trying to rescue another person and toward understanding themselves. Betrayal becomes more than a painful memory. It becomes a doorway to greater self-awareness. As this awareness grows, compassion is no longer directed only toward others. It is finally extended inward. The empath begins recognizing that forgiveness does not require continued access, and kindness does not demand endless sacrifice. Healthy boundaries stop feeling like acts of rejection and begin feeling like acts of self-respect. The need for constant approval gradually fades, replaced by a quieter confidence rooted in personal truth rather than external validation. This transformation is why betrayal often becomes the turning point in the super empath's journey. What was intended to weaken them instead strengthens their ability to recognize authenticity, protect their emotional well-being, and make wiser choices. The wound does not disappear overnight, but it becomes a source of insight rather than limitation. Through that process, empathy evolves into wisdom, and wisdom ensures that the same patterns are far less likely to control the future. The false self is a psychological mask created to protect a person from feelings they find too painful to confront. Instead of building an identity on genuine self-acceptance, they construct an image designed to earn admiration, maintain control, or avoid vulnerability. This outward personality may appear confident, successful, charming, or emotionally untouchable, but beneath the surface, it often depends heavily on validation from others. As long as people continue reinforcing this image, the illusion remains intact. Yet, the moment that external support begins to disappear, the stability of that identity can begin to weaken. When a super empath enters the picture, this process becomes especially significant. Unlike someone who is impressed only by appearances, the empath naturally responds to authenticity. They appreciate kindness over status, honesty over perfection, and emotional depth over performance. At first, this genuine attention can feel deeply rewarding to a person who relies on admiration because it provides validation that seems more meaningful than ordinary praise. The empath offers trust, understanding, and emotional investment without demanding that the other person constantly prove their worth. The situation changes dramatically when betrayal breaks that connection. Once the empath recognizes repeated manipulation or emotional dishonesty, they often begin withdrawing the energy that once sustained the relationship. This withdrawal is not always loud or dramatic. It may happen through silence, healthier boundaries, or a refusal to participate in familiar cycles of guilt and emotional control. What disappears is not simply another relationship, but the steady emotional reflection that helped support the false identity. Without that reinforcement, maintaining the carefully crafted image becomes increasingly difficult. The individual may seek attention elsewhere, attempt to rewrite the story, or search for new sources of admiration. Yet these efforts often provide only temporary relief. The deeper issue remains unresolved because it exists within, not around them. External approval can distract from inner emptiness, but it cannot permanently replace genuine self-understanding. This is why the collapse of the false self is ultimately an internal process rather than an external defeat. It is the growing tension between the identity a person presents to the world and the reality they continue avoiding within themselves. The super empath does not create this conflict. Their absence simply removes one of the mirrors that once reflected acceptance, making it harder for illusion to hide what has never truly been healed. Emotional control is one of the most subtle forms of power because it rarely depends on physical force or obvious authority. Instead, it grows through repeated psychological patterns that influence how another person thinks, feels, and responds. A person who relies on emotional control often learns to shape conversations, create uncertainty, shift responsibility, or alternate between affection and distance in ways that keep others emotionally invested. These patterns are effective only as long as the other person continues reacting in predictable ways. Once those reactions change, the foundation of that control begins to weaken. A super empath is especially vulnerable to these patterns in the beginning because they naturally seek understanding rather than conflict. They tend to give second chances, assume misunderstandings can be resolved through honest communication, and believe that patience can restore harmony. This willingness to see potential in others often leads them to overlook behaviors that repeatedly leave them feeling confused or emotionally drained. They continue offering compassion, hoping that genuine care will inspire genuine change. Over time, however, repeated betrayal begins revealing a pattern rather than a series of isolated mistakes. The empath gradually realizes that every cycle follows a familiar rhythm. Moments of warmth are followed by emotional distance. Honest questions are met with deflection. Boundaries are treated as personal attacks instead of healthy expressions of self-respect. As these patterns become clearer, the empath starts responding differently. Instead of explaining, defending, or pleading to be understood, they become more grounded in their own perception of reality. This shift changes the entire emotional dynamic. Reactions that once fueled manipulation, guilt, fear, self-doubt, or the constant need to fix the relationship begin to disappear. Calm replaces anxiety. Observation replaces impulsive emotional responses. The empath no longer feels responsible for carrying another person's emotional burdens or protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. When emotional control loses its influence, the relationship itself changes in profound ways. Attempts to provoke guilt no longer achieve the same result. Silent treatment no longer creates panic. Empty promises no longer restore broken trust. The strategies remain the same, but they no longer produce the desired effect because the emotional dependency that sustained them has dissolved. The greatest transformation is not that one person gains power over the other. It is that genuine inner stability replaces emotional vulnerability, allowing the empath to act from clarity rather than fear, and from self-respect rather than the constant need for approval. Every human being carries a hidden side of the personality that remains outside ordinary awareness. It consists of emotions, memories, desires, fears, and unresolved experiences that have been pushed aside because they were too painful, confusing, or uncomfortable to acknowledge. These hidden aspects do not disappear simply because they are ignored. Instead, they continue influencing thoughts, relationships, and behavior from beneath the surface. The more someone avoids these inner realities, the more power they often gain over everyday life. Relationships have a unique way of bringing these hidden parts into the light. A deep emotional connection acts like a mirror, revealing qualities that usually remain unnoticed when a person is alone. This is especially true when the relationship involves a super empath. Their authenticity, emotional sensitivity, and willingness to connect honestly create an environment where unconscious patterns become increasingly difficult to hide. Without intending to do so, they often expose emotional contradictions simply by remaining genuine. When betrayal enters the relationship, this process becomes even more intense. For the super empath, betrayal forces them to confront questions they may have avoided for years. Why did they continue giving when they felt unseen? Why did they ignore repeated warning signs? Why did they believe love alone could transform someone who was unwilling to change? These questions are painful, but they also become the beginning of profound self-discovery. Instead of remaining trapped in familiar patterns, the empath gradually uncovers hidden fears of abandonment, people-pleasing habits, or the belief that their worth depends on being needed. Recognizing these patterns allows them to grow beyond them. The same betrayal can awaken a very different confrontation within the other person. If someone has built their identity around control, superiority, or emotional avoidance, the loss of genuine connection may expose feelings they have spent years escaping. Loneliness, insecurity, shame, or fear of vulnerability may quietly emerge beneath the surface. Whether these emotions lead to growth depends entirely on their willingness to face them honestly rather than covering them with new distractions or familiar defenses. This is why betrayal can become a powerful psychological turning point. It strips away comforting illusions and leaves each person standing before parts of themselves they can no longer ignore. One path leads toward greater self-awareness, emotional maturity, and authentic healing. The other leads toward deeper denial and repeated patterns. The defining difference is not the betrayal itself, but whether the hidden aspects of the personality are faced with courage or pushed back into darkness once again. Silence is often mistaken for weakness, surrender, or the inability to defend oneself. Yet in its deepest psychological sense, silence can represent something entirely different. It can signal that a person no longer feels compelled to justify their worth, argue against false accusations, or chase someone who has repeatedly dismissed their truth. This kind of silence does not arise from fear. It emerges from inner clarity. It is the quiet confidence of someone who has realized that peace is more valuable than winning every argument. For a super empath, reaching this state is rarely immediate. After betrayal, their first instinct is often to seek understanding. They may try to communicate honestly, explain their feelings, or repair what has been damaged. They believe that openness and compassion can bridge emotional distance. However, when these sincere efforts are met with repeated manipulation, denial, or emotional games, they slowly recognize that not every conflict can be resolved through conversation. Some people are not avoiding the truth because they cannot see it. They avoid it because accepting it would require them to change. This realization transforms the empath's relationship with silence. Instead of using words to convince someone who has already chosen misunderstanding, they begin protecting their emotional energy. They stop responding to every provocation, every attempt to create guilt, and every invitation to repeat the same exhausting cycle. Their silence becomes an expression of emotional discipline rather than emotional withdrawal. It is not meant to punish another person. It is meant to preserve their own inner balance. The psychological effect of this change can be significant. Emotional manipulation depends on predictable reactions. If guilt no longer creates compliance, criticism no longer creates self-doubt, and distance no longer creates desperation, familiar strategies lose much of their influence. The absence of emotional reactions forces the other person to confront a reality they may have never expected. The source of control they once relied upon is no longer available. Perhaps the greatest power of silence lies in what it communicates without speaking. It says that self-respect no longer requires constant explanation. It says that boundaries do not need endless defense to remain valid. Most importantly, it reflects a profound inner transformation. The super empath has shifted from seeking validation in another person's approval to finding stability within themselves. In that quiet space, silence is no longer emptiness. It becomes a language of strength, wisdom, and emotional freedom that words alone could never fully express. One of the deepest consequences of betrayal is not simply the loss of trust in another person. It is the opportunity to rediscover the parts of yourself that were gradually abandoned in the effort to preserve the relationship. A super empath often gives their time, emotional energy, patience, and understanding without expecting much in return. They naturally focus on the needs of others, believing that genuine love is expressed through compassion and sacrifice. While these qualities can create meaningful relationships, they can also lead the empath to neglect their own emotional well-being when the relationship becomes one-sided. This gradual loss of self rarely happens all at once. It begins with small compromises that seem harmless at first. Personal boundaries become more flexible. Personal dreams are postponed. Feelings are minimized to avoid conflict. The empath starts measuring their worth by how much they can help, heal, or support another person. Over time, they may no longer recognize how much of their identity has become centered around maintaining the relationship rather than nurturing their own growth. Betrayal interrupts this pattern in a painful but revealing way. The emotional shock forces the empath to ask questions that had been buried beneath years of giving. Who was I before I spent so much energy trying to save someone else? What values have I ignored? What passions have I placed aside? These questions do not merely focus on the relationship that ended. They point toward the relationship the empath has with themselves. As healing progresses, something remarkable begins to emerge. The empath no longer defines themselves by another person's approval, attention, or emotional availability. They begin making choices based on their own values instead of constant accommodation. Boundaries stop feeling selfish and start feeling necessary. Solitude becomes a place of restoration rather than loneliness. The desire to be chosen by someone else is gradually replaced by the commitment to choose themselves every single day. This process is not about becoming cold, distant, or incapable of love. The empath does not lose compassion. Instead, compassion becomes balanced with wisdom. They continue caring deeply, but they no longer confuse self-sacrifice with genuine connection. Their kindness is guided by discernment rather than obligation, and their generosity is protected by healthy limits. Identity reclamation is ultimately the return to authenticity. The person who once searched for validation in another's acceptance discovers that true security comes from living in alignment with their own values, honoring their own emotions, and refusing to abandon themselves for the sake of preserving relationships that require them to become someone they were never meant to be. The greatest consequence of betrayal is often misunderstood because people naturally focus on what can be seen. They notice the end of the relationship, the silence that follows, or the emotional pain experienced by the person who was hurt. Yet the most profound effects are rarely visible. They unfold quietly within the mind, where identity, beliefs, and emotional patterns are constantly being shaped. While the super empath begins a journey toward healing and self-discovery, the deepest consequences for the person who caused the betrayal are often internal rather than external. A person who depends heavily on admiration, emotional control, or constant validation may appear unaffected on the surface, They may quickly move into new relationships, seek attention from different people, or project an image of confidence and success. To outside observers, it can seem as though they have escaped the emotional consequences entirely. However, external appearances do not always reflect internal reality. Temporary distractions can postpone self-reflection, but they cannot permanently replace genuine emotional fulfillment or inner peace. The super empath represented something that could not easily be replaced. Their acceptance was not based on status, appearance, or achievement. It came from seeing another human being with sincerity and compassion. When that authentic connection is lost because of repeated betrayal, what disappears is more than a relationship. The opportunity to experience genuine emotional intimacy also fades. Future admiration from others may satisfy the desire for attention, but it cannot recreate the depth of trust that once existed. This creates a subtle psychological conflict. Every new source of validation may provide temporary reassurance, yet the underlying feelings of emptiness, insecurity, or emotional isolation remain unresolved if they are never honestly confronted. The search for external affirmation continues because the internal foundation has never been strengthened. Without genuine self-awareness, the same patterns often repeat in different relationships, producing similar disappointments despite changing circumstances. Meanwhile, the super empath gradually builds a different kind of strength. Instead of seeking someone to complete their identity, they develop a deeper relationship with themselves. The emotional energy once spent trying to earn love is redirected toward personal growth, healthier relationships, and authentic self-respect. Their healing becomes an internal victory rather than an external performance. This is why the greatest consequence is ultimately psychological. One person gains freedom by facing painful truths and growing beyond them. The other risks remaining trapped within familiar patterns if those truths continue to be avoided. The lasting impact is not determined by who appeared stronger after the relationship ended, but by who was willing to confront their inner world with honesty and transform because of it.